You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas.
Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
It is a perfectly stormy, humid, and disgusting afternoon here in Southeast Virginia. What's it doing for you up there in Connecticut, Mr. Thomas?
Oh, it's beautiful. It's summery. It's like 86 degrees. Blue sky, puffy white clouds. Quite lovely.
You're getting better weather than we have had here recently. It has been a nasty, scorching, sweltering mess.
And here I am thinking I want to get back down to Virginia as soon as possible. Maybe I'll wait a few weeks.
Yeah, you may need to wait a couple of weeks. It should get nicer. It's Virginia weather. Wait 5 minutes, it'll change.
That's what they say in New England.
We want to thank everybody for your excellent feedback on our 2 episodes with Kate Miles about the breaks in the Shenandoah case. Everybody has been very interested and enthusiastic. We do have some additional questions that people have sent to Kate, which we will get to her as soon as possible. And if we can get Kate to join us one more time, we certainly will shoot for that. Bill, how do you feel about everything that has happened here with the Shenandoah case, having Kate on and having some answers in this case? Whenever we get big news like this, it always knocks us for a loop.
Having Kate Miles back on Mind Over Murder was really a lot of fun. And even though we're discussing something that's very serious, I think giving Kate, who is probably the greatest expert on the Shenandoah murders case outside of law enforcement, back on the podcast was really a great experience. And I can tell, because questions continue to come in, that our listeners have a lot more questions for Kate. If anything, having Kate on twice makes me want to have her on for a third question and answer session, because it's such an interesting case. Obviously, we're thrilled that we're starting to see some resolution, if you will, of the Shenandoah murders. 28 years is a long time to wait for answers. So for Julie Williams and Lollie Winans' family, we hope that there's some degree of answers or relief. It's a case, I think, that warrants further discussion. And I know there's some things we want to get into in today's episode about what we'd like to see for next steps.
We also, of course, want to spend a little bit of time talking about the fact that we have seen now in the last 6-7 months of the year 2 press conferences from the FBI announcing breaks in significantly cold cases, shall we say. Or I suppose they wouldn't want us saying cold cases. I guess they would want us to say old cases, because they say that they've been working on these. But we definitely noticed some similarities between the 2 press conferences, ours on January 8th and the one announcing the Shenandoah case just a couple of weeks ago. And so we want to spend a little bit of time exploring them. I do want to take a minute and kind of detour down the old case versus cold case route. How do you think the FBI would want to categorize these? Would they want to admit to these being cold cases, or would they refer to them as something else?
I think I've told you before that years ago, when I first got more directly involved in the Colonial Parkway murders after the FBI lost control of 78 highly graphic crime scene photos, a story that then broke in Virginia media, thanks to our friend Mike Mather from WTKR News in Norfolk, Virginia. The assistant special agent in charge of the FBI Norfolk office at that time was a guy named Brian Hanlon. So he would have been the number 2 guy in that office. And he'd actually taken over as the special agent in charge, the number 1 guy, for a time as well. Hanlon said to me, "Your sister's case is at the bottom of a very dusty pile," which was an honest answer, although a hard one to hear. I know that law enforcement always resists the idea of cold cases, but we've had that cold case excuse thrown back in our faces so many times that I'm not willing to accept anyone saying there is no such thing as a cold case, because behind closed doors, when we're not on the air here at Mind Over Murder, various agents who've worked this case have told me your sister's case is a cold case. And so when you hear it over and over again, privately, it's real. Sometimes law enforcement, and the FBI is probably in this category, will insist there is no such thing as a cold case. I'm not buying it. They've said it too many times to me privately and other family members. We've come to understand that there is such a thing as a cold case. I could make a very convincing argument, I think, as to why cases go cold, but that's a whole nother discussion. I'm pleased with the developments in the Julie Williams-Lollie Winans case. It's very frustrating for media people like Kate Miles and other reporters who are now circling back with the FBI with additional questions, and they are getting nowhere. They are getting the complete straight arm. The FBI is refusing to answer questions. I know one of our journalist friends then shifted gears and reached out to the United States Attorney for the Shenandoah murders case, and he refused to answer questions, referring them back to the FBI. And of course, the FBI is absolutely refusing to answer any other questions. And I think this is completely unacceptable, because it is not unreasonable for journalists and even podcasters like ourselves to be asking, tell us more about how you solved this case. There's nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, I feel strongly, as we talked about recently, that the public has a right to know these things. We've been waiting for answers in the Shenandoah case for 28 years. Suddenly they make an announcement, and I do mean suddenly, and they want to talk for 20 minutes in a press conference and then sign off and not answer a single additional question. I think this is completely insane, and the lack of transparency here is really frustrating.
Now, I know, Bill, in your previous life, in your professional life, prior to Mind Over Murder and all of this, you'd mentioned before that you have put together press conferences in the past. How would you have done this differently if it was up to you to put together a press conference with regard to these cases? What would you allow that maybe the FBI didn't allow? What would you have been doing differently?
In both examples, in the Colonial Parkway Murders press conference on January 8th, 2024, and then the Shenandoah Murders press conference just a couple of weeks ago. First of all, both of these press conferences were announced on extremely short notice. Remember, these cases have been around for 3 decades. We're closing in on 4 decades in the Colonial Parkway Murders. So it isn't like these developments and the good news, in other words, solves are good news if you've been waiting for answers for 30 to 37 years. These press conferences are being announced on essentially a crash basis. They make a lot of very odd decisions about what they will say to the press before the conference actually takes place. Remember back in January when we got the advance copy of what had been sent out, which is basically a media advisory. And I've done these before. You want to try, if you're serious about coverage, and that's a big if in this example, you want to try to let your reporters know what is going to be discussed. You might not tell them everything, but you want to grab their attention. You want them to attend the press conference, either virtually or in person, or participate in some way. And actually, the FBI seems to have gone out of their way to limit participation. Even reporter friends said to us at the time of the news in the Colonial Parkway murders, when they announced that Robin Edwards, David Knobling, and Teresa Howell's murders were connected to Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., they never called the case the Colonial Parkway murders. Reporters came back to us and said, if they had said Colonial Parkway murders, there would have been a lot more coverage of this case. And there would have been a lot more national coverage, because obviously the Colonial Parkway murders have been around for 37 years and have become a well-known case, partly through our efforts and the efforts of Virginia media and media across the country. So to quietly put out this kind of last minute, I think it was a Monday morning, if I'm not mistaken, press announcement saying there was going to be an update on these cases in Isle of Wight without ever mentioning who they were talking about, who the victims were, the fact that this is part of the Colonial Parkway murders, one begins to think, gee, there seems to be a real effort here to limit the amount of press coverage and even interest from reporters.
Yeah, I think that is very much a fair assessment. For anybody who hasn't worked in the same line of work that you have, when a news advisory goes out and then when a press kit follows up, for anybody who's not familiar, can you explain what a news advisory is and what does a press kit look like?
An advisory, usually called a media advisory, is usually a one-pager that goes out electronically to as many media people as possible. You want typically maximum coverage of your story. I think that in both of these examples, significant effort went into not achieving maximum coverage because they actually wanted to just quietly put these stories out. So the media advisory, which is usually embargoed, and that's a very specific term of art that says this is going to happen at such and such a time. Usually you try to give people a couple of days notice, and that did not happen in either one of these press conferences, and I believe that is also deliberate on the part of the FBI and the Virginia State Police. They were meeting with the families several days before. They could have sent out a media advisory with an embargo, that is, you can't write about it or discuss it until such and such a time. Media people try to be respectful of these embargoes. So if they say hold for Tuesday morning at 10 a.m., I'm just making this up. So you might send that out Monday morning so you can make arrangements to get as many media people participating in covering, writing about. Remember, in some cases, if they want to have a television crew there or a radio team there, they've got to get there and get set up. You actually want to give them some notice. There is this understanding that they're not going to write about it or talk about it or publicize it in any way until after the embargo date. When you see things like this happening where the press conferences are set up on extremely short notice, this is breaking news. You could make that argument. But remember, they've been working on these cases literally for decades. They could have easily built in a few extra days so that they sent out the media advisory and said, please be here at this time and place if you want to have a camera crew here or a live radio team covering the story. If anything, they were doing exactly the opposite. At the same time, we talked to Kate Miles the other day. In my opinion, Kate Miles is probably the greatest expert on the Shenandoah case of anyone outside of law enforcement. She wasn't invited to the press conference. She wasn't even sent an invitation to dial in to the press conference or watch it online. You begin to realize they're not very serious about getting the word out. Now, what's weird from my perspective is I actually think this is good news, as I said a minute ago. The fact that the FBI and the Virginia State Police are working back through cold cases, finding funding through the SAKI program, the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative program, testing and retesting evidence, and finding answers, this is great news. They should be proud of it. And yet, what would my mom say about hiding your light under a bushel? It seems like they don't want to talk about what I regard as good news.
One further point of clarification there. When you say dialed into a press conference, I know that means something very specific. Can you explain what that means to get a number to dial into the conference?
So what they do is they typically will have an internet address and you have to sign in, identify yourself. So you say, I'm Bill Thomas, I'm from such and such a radio station, TV station, whatever. They would be checking your credentials. It's almost like the equivalent of being physically at the press conference, and they would have a clipboard and they would have, here are all the names of all the people that are expected to be there.
Oh, okay.
When they say dial in, they mean literally dial in on a phone. Obviously, things are much more internet focused now. A lot of times there'll be a live stream, which would involve then people signing in and using their credentials. They might need your email address or your phone number or both, as well as your name and title, what media organization you're representing. But if you're really looking for maximum coverage, you're trying to reach as many reporters and media outlets as possible. And you want to encourage people to participate. In other words, you think this is important enough news to have a news conference, then I think you would want to have as much coverage as possible. In both of these examples, these were run by two separate offices. It was FBI Norfolk field office in the Colonial Parkway Murders matter, and it was FBI Richmond in the Shenandoah murders coverage. But the approach, the whole hiding your light under a bushel thing, I think my mom would laugh at me from heaven for using these expressions she used to use. It starts to feel like they actually don't want coverage, or they certainly don't want maximum coverage. I was preparing for today's discussion and looking at the two press conferences, which are available online, and we'll link them in the show notes. So you can actually go back, and on YouTube, you can watch the entire press conference. They're remarkably short. They're both only about 20 to 23 minutes long, which is very short for a press conference. Again, it starts to feel like, gee, you guys aren't really very serious about answering questions here and getting the word out. One of the things we criticized in the Colonial Parkway Murders press conference was there was something very odd about the setup in the room. There weren't sufficient mics in the room. It was very difficult to hear what the reporters were asking. Mm-hmm. And I got to criticize again here. I've done this. You set up microphones in the room so that people can step up or pass the wireless mic around, and they can say, I'm Andy Fox from WAVY, and then ask their question. If you have the room set up, and these are professionals, if you have the room set up in a way that people around the country and even around the world that are watching this thing live on their computers for the most part, if they can't hear the questions, it's not a very meaningful dialogue. And this is another failure on their part. If you have a situation like that, where it's hard to hear the questions being asked, the protocol, and I'm really going to emphasize this because I've done this. If Kristin Dilley is a reporter and she's asking me a question, and I'm not sure the audience, which is often well outside the room, cannot hear her original question, the protocol is to repeat the question. So Kristin will say, how did you find out about this new information, or whatever the question is? The spokesperson would typically repeat the question so that everybody around the world could hear what the question was. Mm-hmm. If you're not doing that, you're not being serious. And that was very noticeable. We keep calling it the Colonial Parkway Murders press conference. They were doing everything they could not to call that case the Colonial Parkway Murders. They kept referring to it as the Isle of Wight Murders. And as we discussed here previously, no one has ever called this case the Isle of Wight Murders. We're just making stuff up now. And we're making stuff up because we don't want to refer to this case as the Colonial Parkway Murders. And I'm sorry, I didn't make up the name either, but that is the name that the media and the public know that case as. Mm-hmm. So there seems to be a real effort made not to take questions seriously and not respond to them in a serious way.
I think this goes back to what Kate was referring to, and I love that she used this, so I'm going to start using this term as well. I love the fact that she said she would love for the FBI and all law enforcement agencies involved to show their work.
Yes.
Which is an admonition that we hear in math classrooms at high schools, for example, where I teach. But I think there is a really excellent point there. I would love to know, we all would love to know, how did Walter Leo Jackson make his way onto your radar? The guy was in jail in Ohio multiple times, and not nearly long enough each time, but we'll get into that in a couple of minutes. How did this guy come onto your radar? There is something very unsatisfying, but also very cagey about saying, here's a suspect. We have found this person. He's been linked via DNA, but we're looking for more information about him, but that's it. They didn't give any other bits of information. And Kate had a whole list of things that she said she had basically written to the FBI in answer to this. She, among other things, wanted to know what evidence was retested, what DNA was ultimately retested. Why did you use private labs instead of the Quantico labs? Which private lab did you go to before you went to the one that you went with? Were the results all loaded into CODIS? Will they be compared to other crimes in the area? And that's just some of the ones that Kate had asked about. She'd asked for many more. Why isn't the FBI willing to answer those questions? Why aren't they willing to show their work? I think it's a great, worthy, natural question to ask.
One of our listeners actually said earlier today that she wants us to design a shirt that says FBI, please show your work. The thing is, what's crazy, and it makes me completely insane, is I really do mean this. This is outstanding work in both of these cases. They're going back, retesting evidence, and solving cold cases that are decades old, and we have praised them for that work. It almost feels like they're not proud of their work, which I don't really believe to be the case.
Yeah, this is bananas. You're talking two of the biggest cases in Virginia, two of the most well-known cases in Virginia, and you guys are starting to crack them. Please be proud of this. Trumpet this. This is important. You're right. I don't understand why they're being cagey about it. I'd be singing it from the rooftops if it were me.
And what's strange, too, is that when questions were asked, and we talked about this before, with Andy Fox and other reporters asking, when did Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. first move onto your radar in the Colonial Parkway murders? The question was asked twice, and the spokeswoman refused to answer the question twice. I'm sorry, that's ludicrous. It's not an unfair question. It's not a gotcha question. But of course, they didn't want to talk about the fact that Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. was suspect number one in the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley, as we talked about last week on Mind Over Murder. Now this is getting more coverage in the press because we're calling them out on this. They even told the families privately they're 99% certain. And I understand that not every family member who was there participated in that discussion. Was said, it was quoted to me directly. I certainly didn't make it up. Law enforcement seems to want to avoid discussing anything that might hint at a shortcoming in terms of their investigation. And my attitude is, oh, come on. First of all, these cases are 28 to 37 years old. Of course things went wrong, which is how we get to a case being 28 to 37 years old. And at the same time, and we've talked about this with experts here on Mind Over Murder, the science, the forensics, DNA testing have gotten so much better. There's a reason why these advances are taking place. But in failing to even highlight a bit of the backstory about how they got to where they got to, I think the FBI and the Virginia State Police are really failing the public, because explain how this happened. It's also ludicrous that these cases, which go back decades, they're blowing through these press conferences in 23 minutes. It's because they don't want to answer questions. That kind of sucks. It's not good public policy. It doesn't help law enforcement's reputation. And I know our friends in law enforcement complain all the time that the public doesn't seem to trust them. This is the kind of crap that makes people not trust the FBI, the Virginia State Police, and law enforcement in general, because they feel like they're not being straightforward with us, because they're not. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. Before we get back to the podcast, just wanted to remind you that we have a GoFundMe effort going on right now. This campaign is designed to help us raise funds to help promote Mind Over Murder, and specifically to push the Colonial Parkway Murders investigation forward. We'd love it if you could support us in any way that you can. Any donation from $5 to whatever you can afford is very much appreciated and will be incredibly helpful. The link is in the show notes and in our social media pages. As always, thanks for your support. Now back to Mind Over Murder.
Kate made an excellent comparison to the Golden State Killer case and how meticulous the investigators were when they talked about, here's how we solved the case. Here's how we picked up the DNA. Here's how it was tested. Here's the genetic genealogy. They can't give you chapter and verse, of course. But in a case like this, and you had mentioned this last time with Kate as well, both of these offenders are dead. Walter Leo Jackson and Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. are dead. There is not going to be a trial. You are hurting zero things by letting us just get the barest hint of how you went about making these answers come about for these families. And you are, I think, actually doing a disservice if you're not willing to spend a little more time and explain, look, here's how we did it. The science is better. This is the process that we went through. Any questions we can answer about that? It does feel very much like the public is being done a disservice to.
Both of those press conferences, if they were properly run, should have run at least 2 hours. They should have taken questions until the reporters had no more questions to ask. They also should have given sufficient notice to the press in D.C. and in Virginia so that they could be there. When you announce a press conference with a couple of hours notice, that means that a lot of reporters who've already gotten their assignments for that day, they have editors or news directors that tell them, please go out and work this story. So in a lot of those examples, those reporters would have already been committed to something else. So they're out with their crews, doing research, shooting video, recording audio, whatever it is. And when you announce a press conference, you're basically springing it on the public and on the media outlets. So when you're announcing a press conference 2, 3, 4 hours in advance, that's not sufficient notice. And after a while, that starts to feel deliberate, like you aren't proud of the work that you've done. And my heart of hearts says that's not true, that the teams that have worked these cases are proud of the work that they've done. But whoever's in charge of media relations has decided, we want to keep this on the down low. We don't really want to talk about the case because someone might ask us a question that highlights one of the areas where we screwed up. Come on. We need to be grown up about this. As I've said before, I screw up plenty in my life. And what I try to do, I'm not claiming to be perfect here. My partner Pamela and my family could tell you long stories. But when I do screw up, I try to calm down and let people know that I'm sorry for what happened and that I will try to learn from that and try to make sure that mistake doesn't happen again. The FBI seems completely incapable of ever approaching anything like that level of grace where they just admit, hey, we had Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. in custody. We questioned him. We searched his premises. We gave him 2 polygraph examinations. But based on the evidence that we had and the science available to us in 1988, we did not have enough to charge this man. So we had to let him go. I don't think that's an unreasonable explanation and probably not far from the truth of what happened. But for them to refuse to acknowledge how and when Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. first moved onto their radar, this is absurd and insulting.
I agree. And I also want to take a moment here to speak out on behalf of what was unsaid at the press conference about the Shenandoah, which is that the FBI did not acknowledge in any way or apologize. An apology would be far too much to ask, but they did not even acknowledge the fact that Daryl David Rice, who was suspect number 1 in this case from the very beginning, they did not offer any apology to, accountability for, explanation for why they continued for years and years to make Daryl David Rice seem to be the person who was responsible for this when it has been proven unequivocally by DNA he was not responsible. That feels worse to me than failing to acknowledge that Wilmer was suspect number 1. They actively ruined Daryl David Rice's life, and they didn't offer anything in the way of, our bad, so sorry, things happen, I think the first thing that I asked you, because this all happened when I was on vacation with my family. Right. I think the first thing that I asked you was, did they say anything about Daryl David Rice? And the answer, of course, was like, no, of course they didn't. But that was really disappointing to me. Again, acknowledgement of past mistakes. It does show a level of grace and maturity, frankly, that the Bureau kind of doesn't seem to have right at the moment. And come on, you ruin the guy's life. Offer something.
Even without an apology, which would never cross the lips of the FBI.
No, it wouldn't.
I think them making it clear that Daryl David Rice is not a suspect in the murder of Julie Williams and Lollie Winans. I was about to say, nor has he been for a number of years. But again, I can't ever seem to see them doing that. It's really unfortunate. I don't know where this institutional arrogance and rigidity come from. They really have to do better than this. They are not even acknowledging past mistakes. I did find it interesting that at the press conference regarding the Shenandoah, that they specifically mentioned that there was no connection to the murders of Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski.
Yeah, I was about to go there.
I found that interesting. I don't object. Actually appreciate more. I actually want more information. So,
right.
It was upsetting to hear their names mentioned in that context. I appreciated it nonetheless.
Were you given the option to dial into this press conference because of that possible connection with Kathy and Becky, or no?
I was not given that option. I was given the number by friends of ours in the media. I thought about it, but given the friction between the FBI and myself over the past year, things are better now, but as I've mentioned before, a year ago, things were very heated, and it got really ugly and even threatening behind closed doors, which I was not happy about. So even though I had the number and the code to dial into the call, I decided not to call into the Shenandoah press conference. As we've talked about before, the FBI deliberately tied me up on the phone for 2.5 hours during the Colonial Parkway Murders press conference. And again, no disrespect to the agent who provided me with an in-depth briefing, but coincidentally set for 1:30 p.m. on the day of the press conference so that I couldn't listen to or watch the press conference until many hours later. These things happen over and over again. They're not a coincidence. They are deliberate, and these reindeer games get really old. In answer to your question, in the Shenandoah press conference, I had the information but made the decision not to call in.
Actually, we did have one of the many questions that came in for Kate. There was also one that came in for you, and it was a listener who wanted to know, okay, Bill, during that 2 hours when you were tied up with the case agent, can you say what was discussed? And I don't think you've ever even told me what was discussed.
It was an in-depth briefing from our case agent. That's all I'm going to say.
Continuing with Walter Leo Jackson, we are very lucky that we have a number of excellent people who are willing to provide us some additional help and legwork on a research basis, because while we love being able to do the podcast, we are not always able to devote the amount of time that we would like to doing every single bit of research that it requires. And so we do reach out to ask listeners from time to time for help. And we were lucky enough to have a well-intentioned research assistant reach out to us and give us some information on Walter Leo Jackson, who has been identified as the culprit behind the murders of Julie Williams and Lollie Winans. They found a very interesting and quite disturbing article from the Cleveland, Ohio Plain Dealer from August 24th, 2011, detailing the last of the crimes that resulted in him being imprisoned from 2012 to the end of his life at 2018. We wanted to share that information with all of you, although we would warn you, of course, that this is quite disturbing. So this is from the Cleveland, Ohio Plain Dealer, August 24th, 2011. This is from the Law and Order section. It's quite a short article. The headline reads, Man accused of abducting, raping teen. Walter L. Jackson, 63, of North Olmsted, pleaded not guilty Tuesday to 2 counts of kidnapping, 4 counts of rape, and 2 counts of felonious assault in Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court for crimes against an 18-year-old Cleveland girl on August 10th. Prosecutors said Jackson approached the girl at 2 p.m. at West 58th Street and Madison Avenue and asked if she needed a ride. The girl got in Jackson's van and they went to the parking lot at Don's Lighthouse. Jackson reportedly bound her legs, put handcuffs on her, gagged her mouth, and struck her in the head with a blunt object and engaged in sex, said Ryan Madej, spokesperson for the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office. Jackson drove to West 46th Street and Train Avenue, where the girl escaped, still bound, gagged, and naked. Jackson tried to get her, but was spotted by several witnesses. Madej said Jackson returned to the van and drove away, but a witness followed him in a car and used his OnStar system to contact police. He followed him to Rocky River, where police arrested Jackson on Worcester Road. Jackson was being held in jail on $250,000 bail. Madej said Jackson has a conviction for felonious assault in 2000. A pretrial date has not yet been scheduled.
It sounds so much like the Julie Williams, Lollie Winans murder, with the use of the handcuffs and duct tape, restraining her, the sexual assault. And this guy, as we understand it, we're learning more about him, but he sounds like a repeat offender who has been involved in rapes and kidnappings for years. I know one of the things that Kate had mentioned to us recently is she doubts that the escalation to murder, which we saw in the Julie Williams, Lollie Winans case, is the only time that Jackson would have crossed that line from kidnapping, rape into murder. Also reminds me of Joseph D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, and a number of other people like Samuel Little and many other people we've talked about on this podcast who start at one place and then continue escalating, ultimately crossing over the line from rape into murder. It's very chilling, even just this short article from the Plain Dealer.
This is a very bold thing to do at 2:00 in the afternoon in August. That takes real boldness to be willing to try to abduct someone in broad daylight right in the middle of the day. I feel absolutely horrible for this poor young woman who had to undergo what was undoubtedly an absolutely terrifying ordeal. We are definitely interested in knowing more about Walter Leo Jackson and the crimes for which he was imprisoned. For anybody who may have missed it in our last episodes with Kate, I want to just go ahead and lay out a couple of his dates right here. He was in prison in several different time frames, some of which do exclude him from the Colonial Parkway murders. So I'll go ahead and go down the dates in which he was in prison. And this was released by the FBI. So Walter Leo Jackson was in prison from January 1984 to February 1989. That does exclude him from incidents 1, 2, and 3 in the Colonial Parkway murders, but that does have him out in August of 1989, which is when the incident number 4, Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer, took place. Jackson was also in prison from May 1994 to September 1994. So he is excluded from any crimes that occurred during that time frame. We also know he was in prison from August 2000 to May 2007, and then May 2012 to March 2018. And the prison sentence for that was as a direct result of the crime we just read to you about. It should be noted that he was out and free, walking around from June 1995 until August of 2000. And I think that's very interesting. And 3 of the cases of missing and murdered women in Virginia that took place during that time period, in addition to Julie Williams and Lollie Winans, were the murder of Ashley Showalter Reynolds, Thelma Scroggins, and Anne Carolyn McDaniel, 3 that have been commonly tied together under the Route 29 stalker moniker.
And we want to spend some time in the coming weeks exploring the Route 29 stalker case again. Listen for that in upcoming episodes, because it's certainly a possibility that Jackson could be involved in the Route 29 stalker case. It's very disturbing that someone who is a clear serial offender is in and out of jail in the way that Jackson was. Just have a hard time believing that a multiple offender could be in jail, serve a few years, out again, reoffend, be convicted, sent back to jail. At some point, you just have to lock this guy up and throw away the key. He's just not someone who is able to turn his life around, and he just continues to offend. And as we all know, there are far more sexual assaults that occur than are reported. So it's quite possible that Jackson is involved in a number of other sexual assaults and potential murders as well. I know law enforcement is looking at Jackson again. I would remind everybody, it's not just about putting offenders away. Jackson's been dead now for several years. It's also providing answers to families that have been awaiting answers, in some cases for decades. And that comfort that is provided to those families is very meaningful. If someone was sexually assaulted or murdered by Jackson, they have a right to know that Jackson has died and that he did reoffend a number of times, but we have answers for you in terms of what happened in your own case.
So, Bill, one of the things that I was very interested in this press conference was the fact that the FBI did release, as part of their seeking information on Walter Leo Jackson poster, they mentioned the fact that he had at least 2 vehicles associated with him, the 1984 Chestnut Brown AMC Eagle and the 1979 Econoline 250 van. I can't help calling that the serial killer van. They also mentioned that he had a history of using temporary tags, of altering license plates, and frequently changing vehicles. In your opinion, was the FBI sort of subtly trying to position him as a candidate for the Route 29 stalker?
I'm not sure that's the case in this example. I also think they may be cognizant of the fact that plates were recorded by cameras going in and out of the Shenandoah National Park, but at least one of the cameras was out the weekend that Julie Williams and Lollie Winans were murdered. So I think they're trying to give themselves some wiggle room in that they may not actually have video or still photographs that show via the cameras these vehicles going in and out of the park. As Kate mentioned to us when we spoke to her recently, she did say that in the Darrell David Rice example, they made a big deal about the fact that they had spotted Rice's vehicle going in and out of the park. In mentioning the switching around of plates and using temporary tags, it almost felt like they might have been trying to cover up the possibility that they might not have good still photos or video of Jackson's vehicles going in and out of the park.
I think that's a pretty good assessment. I am interested, though, if they are going to start looking at him as a potential candidate for the Route 29 stalker. I know that we have a subset of people out on the internet who are very interested in exploring the possibility that maybe Rex Heuermann, the Long Island serial killing suspect, may be responsible for the Route 29 stalkings. I feel like that's maybe a little bit of a stretch. But I think it would be interesting to see, is there anything in those cases that that the FBI can run down and try to figure out, can we definitively rule him in or out?
Agreed. And I think I'd love to return to further discussion on the Rex Heuermann, Gilgo Beach 4, Long Island serial killer case as well. Lots of interesting developments in that case recently. Discussion for another time.
Absolutely. We do have a whole lot to discuss, and so look for another episode of Mind Over Murder dropping soon. wherever you get your podcasts. In the meantime, if you like what we're doing, please make sure that you leave us a 5-star rating or review on your nearest podcast platform. Please make sure that you do buy some of our merch from TeePublic, because that does help us keep the lights on, literally sometimes, as well as figuratively. And look for some more information coming soon about future events that we've got going on here in the great state of Virginia. That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.